Hello and welcome back. Now, today we've got a bit of an interesting one because I was watching a TV show that I'm pretty sure everyone's already watched called The Vikings. Oh. And on this show, there was a scene where Floki, the boat builder, ends up going over to Iceland, or was depicted as Iceland at least anyway. And during one of his expeditions, he seems to find a cache of Christian treasure. So that got me thinking, what the hell? What was that? Why? What? I thought that the Vikings, or the quote-unquote Vikings, discovered Iceland. Now, I've got a very, very good friend of mine called Tommy. Hello, Tommy. And his mother is actually from Iceland. So, I thought who better to ask than the man himself. And what he told me was that he spoke to his mother and she even confirmed that it wasn't discovered by Norse people. Now, this is where there's a lot of dispute and there'll be a lot of arguments in the comments potentially on this. However, we're going to get into it and I'm going to break it all down for you and then we can decide at the end. So, the historical records right now show that it was actually the Vikings that discovered it. I'm not disputing that. I'm proposing the other side of the argument that kind of uses a lot of historical information. I'm going to compile it all into an argument for other people to have discovered it at least, not to have settled it per se. So, let's unpack this because the ending of this story is actually quite surprising. But before we continue, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and let me know what you think in the comments as well. So, this story begins in a lovely place in Ireland. According to a man called Dicuil in 825 AD, he wrote about some Irish holy men who travelled to the Northern Islands, and he described their journey with long summer days, and it was a remote island. Now, it doesn't say Iceland, but this is where things get a little bit interesting because long summer days is indicative of Iceland itself and it potentially being there. But this is part of a greater movement. There was a lot of quote-unquote monks at the time, or holy men, who would travel off to remote areas and create, like, not communes, but more like little cells where they'd go and be able to meditate about Jesus. Or something like that. I mean, I was watching a TV show called Evil, and there's a cool little scene in it about they go to this like monk place and they don't speak and they haven't spoken for like hundreds of years, so everyone's quiet and they've got like little notepads that they're writing to each other on. So yeah, monks do weird stuff at times. So going off to a remote island and living up there, I won't put it past them. It was actually part of a greater movement called, let me find it for you, the Peregrini, which translates into Wanderers for Christ, and they travelled all across France, Germany and Italy. So, Irish-born was Dicuil, who wrote about these Irish holy men who travelled to a northern island, which was remote with long days. Now, he was Irish, but he did a lot more of his work in European monasteries in France. Now, we can look at that and we can say, well, it's biased because it's written by the Christians and obviously they want to have discovered everything, right? But it's not exactly that clear, because it gets a bit more interesting. There is a guy called Ari Þorgilsson, and he was considered the first Icelandic historian, and he wrote a book called Íslendingabók. I've probably butchered that, but basically it translates into the Book of Icelanders. And the author lived 1067 to 1148. So we're talking like 250 years after the events happened. But he was a historian, and he was also a priest. So I'll say that he was a priest, and he was also a scholar. However, the book that he wrote was actually written in Old Norse, which gives a bit more of a picture about his lineage, at least. And the fact that it wasn't written in Latin, and he wasn't really connected to any mainstream church at the time, like the Catholics, it seems more plausible. Now, Ari didn't just make a book saying, about these Irish, monks or holy men who arrived there first. He wasn't trying to push the idea. He was writing a book about the settlement of Iceland. And the people that he talks to and references within his book is actually the older people within the settlement. And he writes a lot about the family trees of certain individuals. And he also has this story in it. It almost feels like it's a bit of an added extra rather than the focus of its work. Now, another thing that's in it as well is he covers the genealogy of the people, where everyone came from, and he also covers the establishment of the Althing, which is kind of like their parliament. And it even covers the conversion of Iceland to Christianity in 1000 AD. And more noticeably, it talks about Papar. Now, the Papar are the name of the Irish holy men that travelled up there. Some dispute that it's the same people that's referenced by Dicuil. Dicuil. It sounds like a sleep medication. Does that Dicuil? Dicuil. Now, a lot of people discount this because we don't have any early archaeological evidence that was referenced by Ari, because Ari says that there was crosses, books, and holy monuments, or Christian memorabilia, basically, that was left after the Papar left the area. However, when we look at the credibility of Ari and his work, we see that he does cite sources and he relies on oral testimony among the elders, with documenting the family lineages, and he was known for being historically accurate and not trying to make a saga or not trying to be a storyteller. So the fact that the reign events that we have don't seem to grandize the Papar monks, or I'll call them the Irish monks from now on, or just monks potentially, it kind of seems like a dead ending at the end. And that makes it a bit more interesting, because if it was a fake story and Christian rewriting, in my opinion, I think that they'd have some Christian superhero moment where these monks converted everyone earlier on and the original settlers were Christians, which just wasn't the case. Now, what actually happened was the Papar was on the island due to its remote nature, and eventually, again, if these are holy men and monks, they can't exactly settle the island because the monks, So, when they ended up being on this such remote island, eventually they would have bumped into the Vikings, quote-unquote Vikings at the time, who came over. And according to the story that Ari wrote, they simply just packed up their stuff and went back home because, and I quote, they did not want to be on an island with the heathens. And that's the end of it. They just went home. There was no bloodshed, there was no murder or anything like that. So, historically speaking, we do have an argument to say that it was actually Irish Catholic monks. Catholic's a bit of a stretch because it was so splintered, so many schisms. Oh, Catholicism and schisms. I love that stuff. Sorry if you're a Catholic. I mean the old Catholics. They're not real Catholics. No, I'm going to stop. Right. So, Irish holy men most likely arrived and lived on the island long before the Vikings ever settled it. However, again, it is disputed, I'll give it that. And I'm kind of more leaning into accepting this story. I mean, it's got multiple sources, it's not grandizing into a Catholic superhero story arc, like I said, and it's just a basic fact documented by an Icelandic historian written in Old Norse. And this historian was known to try to be as accurate as possible and not just spin stories. So, with that said, let me know what you think in the comments section. We're back in the living room here because it's a bit warmer. And, I thought I'd give it a go in the living room today. So, with that said, thank you very much, take care, and have a good one.